So now it's time to actually apply the epoxy to our guide wraps. And when it comes to epoxy, what we use and recommend is Pro Coat by Pro Products. And in this version, they're actually preloaded 24 millimeter syringes. Again, it's a 50-50 mix, so it comes with 2 syringes. And to mix, as you would expect, it's very easy. You just put each syringe, make sure it's all out, into the cup. There's one. And there goes 2. And now with a mixing stick, you just stir it to complete. Now it's important to note here, you don't want to whip it like pancake batter or something like that. That creates a lot of air bubbles. Just nice, even rotations and mixing. And usually takes about a minute or 2. Just keep mixing until it becomes clear and most of the bubbles are out. And just take a minute.
So while Greg's finishing mixing that up, we're going to go through the last final processes before we're actually ready to apply our finish. The first thing we want to actually do is make sure that our guides are perfectly aligned. Now, I'm going to do this while it's still in the wrapper, but you feel free at home to pick it up and actually sight down the rod. By referencing our reel seat, I can tell where these guides actually need to line up based on the V's on the support arms of the guides themselves. Now, when you're moving guides within the guide wrap, you actually want to be very gentle. Remember, it's just thread held on with the tension, and if you're too aggressive shifting them around, you can actually loosen a guide wrap to the point of it falling out. So you just want to make minor little tweaks, moving them slightly back and forth to get them into position. Once you're happy and everything's straight, the last little step we want to actually do is go through and remove the marks left from our China marker that we used to line up the guides originally. To do this, I'm going to take a piece of my Pro Wrap thread and actually use it almost as like a little squeegee and just work it back and forth over top of that China marker, and it'll clean the mark off very easily. The reason we do this is if during the finishing process, any of that epoxy gets out onto the China marker, it'll actually be trapped there, and we just want to avoid that.
It'll be there forever. All right, so the epoxy's just about finished here. And I think we can go ahead now and start actually applying the epoxy. So you want to take over here. I'll get rid of the stick. There you go.
All right, so the epoxy finish is actually a relatively easy process. As you can see, the rod is rotating in one of our RDS rod dryers. This is actually going to spin the rod at a constant 9 RPM that will allow the finish to self-level during the curing process. Epoxy finish actually has a cure time of about 8 hours until it's dry to the touch. The reason it cures so long is so that it remains flexible over its entire life. So when we're ready to do this process, the key is actually to coat the guide and the thread completely. You always want to start off by making a nice clean edge. And while I do this, I'm not forcing the brush flat against the guide wrap. I'm just kind of pushing the bead of epoxy around, making sure that it thoroughly coats everything. So once I have my edge started, you can go ahead and paint up the guide wrap towards the edge of the guide wrap. Once we near the end, we'll do the same process as when we started. We'll hold the brush steady and allow a bead of epoxy to create a nice finished edge at the back side of our guide wrap. One thing to note is that the thread will actually create 2 channels on either side of our guide foot. You want to take extra care to take a little bit of the finish and actually fill in those gaps to prevent any water intrusion later on when we're using the rod. You want to make sure and get a nice thorough coating without overloading it. Too much epoxy will actually cause sagging and just really balloon looking finish, so we want to put just the right amount. Once we're all said and done with the actual finishing process, we'll introduce some heat using our alcohol burner to help level out the epoxy a little bit further. We use denatured alcohol in our alcohol lamps because it's actually a clean burning fuel and doesn't produce any soot. Using a butane lighter could actually produce a soot or a contaminant that will actually show up in the epoxy. So with just careful flashes of heat, I'm going to introduce my alcohol burner, and what this process is actually going to do is eliminate any bubbles that may be trapped under the surface and also level the finish perfectly on the rod. With just a couple of quick flashes of heat, you can see some of the epoxy actually beads up underneath. You can whisk away some of that excess. And that's it. We've got a perfectly level, nice, clean, finished guide. Finishing a double foot or a casting guide is the same process as a single foot, just a little more effort. We're going to make a nice, clean, straight edge. Just by pushing the bead of epoxy around the wrap with the head of the brush. We can then fill in the rest of the guide wrap with the finish. For this example, I'm going to coat entirely under the guide foot. Coat up onto the second wrap. And finish it again with a nice clean edge. During this process, you may notice that some of the thread absorbs some of the finish. You can go back and retouch those spots if it looks like it needs a little bit more. Once everything's thoroughly coated, use your alcohol burner again. Flash under the thread without leaving it under there for too long, and this will eliminate the bubbles and help level that finish. And that's all it takes to successfully coat a double foot casting guide. Now, if you've taken the time to apply a custom decal to your rod, you'll actually want to protect that with some of the two-part epoxy finish as well. You'll coat this just like you did the guide foot, evenly applying some of the finish over top of our wraps and spreading it laterally down the rod. Always try to start by making a nice clean edge first and work towards the center of the area you're coating. Make sure that the decal is thoroughly coated and 100% sealed under the epoxy. When you come to the end of your wrap, again, hold your brush flush and make a nice clean edge. You can come back in with your alcohol burner and remove any bubbles, help level the finish, and also eliminate any excess epoxy buildup. This way, your custom decal will last and look great for the entire life of the rod.